Chapter 3, Legal Issues, Part 3. So are you confused about incorporation? You're not alone. Just a couple more words before we get to due process revolution. The bottom line with incorporation is that today, unlike back in the 1800s or even the beginning of the 1900s, state law enforcement officers must obey not only their state constitutions, but also most of the Bill of Rights. We can't say all of it, but almost all of the important provisions have been incorporated. As I said, states don't have to use the grand jury system unless it's required by their state constitution. Pennsylvania doesn't usually use it unless in special cases, but in most cases it doesn't use the grand jury system. Maryland does use it, but that's because it's required under the Maryland Constitution. So the grand jury incorporation has never been incorporated. That means the court looked at it and said, we think other systems of justice are okay. So the states can have differences. They can have a different system of justice when it comes to the grand jury. They don't have to follow the grand jury. But almost all of the other provisions have been incorporated. So we've only had partial or selective incorporation. We haven't had total incorporation. It wasn't until recently that we had the Second Amendment dealing with the right to bear arms incorporated. That was only incorporated within the last decade, actually the last few years. And probably the reason for it was that we didn't have too many politicians who wanted to write anti-gun laws. They knew they wouldn't get elected, and even that's true today. So there weren't that many challenges because there weren't that many laws that were significantly restricting gun ownership and gun possession. But we had some examples, and eventually the court said, yes, the states must obey the Second Amendment. If they write a gun regulation, it must be in compliance with the Second Amendment. So that was one of the last rights that was incorporated, and probably it will be the last one. The ones that aren't incorporated probably never will be. So again, if we can just bring it down to the basics, for the entire history of the Bill of Rights, 1791 to present, the federal government has had to obey all provisions. It's only been since the 1940s, roughly, 1930s, 1940s, that specific provisions of the Bill of Rights have applied to the states as well, that they must also obey the Bill of Rights. So what that means is if a right is incorporated, you can now go and you're concerned about a state action, you can now go into both state courts and federal courts to argue that the action by the government was a violation of your rights. Could be a violation of the state rights, but it can also be a violation perhaps of federal rights as well. So if we used our example, the Philadelphia police officer that we talked about during the last lecture, and we said it was 1845, and the federal courts would kick you right out if you tried to claim that Philadelphia police officer was responsible for obeying the Fourth Amendment. Today, those courts would not kick you out. So today, if you argued that your search and seizure protections had been violated by a local police officer, you can go into federal court and make that argument. So that's the real big difference. And that may seem like a minor difference, but it's made an incredible difference in the kinds of cases that the U.S. Supreme Court hears. Before incorporation, they weren't hearing too many criminal procedure rights cases that were coming up out of the states. And there weren't that many under federal law either, because federal law didn't have that big of a federal law enforcement apparatus. But after incorporation, now the majority of cases that deal with criminal procedure are from the states. And they constitute a large part of the total number of cases that the U.S. Supreme Court hears every year. And so what that means is we produce more uniformity. There's less difference that's allowed from state to state, unlike in the past. And we hope that it's controlling abuses more so that we don't have the problem of sheriff's deputies taking suspects out and hanging them from a tree and hoping to get a confession out of them, that we've done away with some of those major differences. Well, in a key period during this whole incorporation discussion and the evolution of criminal procedure is the due process revolution of the 1960s. The Chief Justice during this time period, and you can see that he was actually Chief Justice in the 1950s, but the Chief Justice was Earl Warren. Now, Earl Warren was probably not someone on first blush that you would suspect would be the leader of a due process revolution. And what we mean by the due process revolution, we'll see it in the PowerPoint in just a second, we mean that to be the period when the U.S. Supreme Court really expanded the rights of criminal defendants, not just in relationship to the police, but also prisons and courts, so during trial, all different phases of the criminal process. But Warren was a Republican politician. In fact, one of the leading Republican politicians of his time. He ran for vice president and almost won in 1948. So if you've ever seen that famous picture of Harry Truman, who won the election as a Democrat in 1948, if you've ever seen that famous picture of him holding up the newspaper that wrongly said Dewey defeats Truman, Earl Warren was the vice president, Republican vice presidential nominee, along with when Dewey was running for president. So he came that close to becoming vice president, and we might have had an entirely different history. But instead, he eventually became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Before that, he was a prosecutor in California around the same time and the same location as August Vollmer, who we talked about in the police history lessons. So he's very much a reformer, believed that if we hold government to high standards, then the people are more likely to comply with the law. So if the government is honest, people are more likely to view the system as fair and to comply with the law. So when he was a prosecutor, he would go around to all of the police departments, all of his assistant prosecutors, and make it clear to them that he never wanted a case overturned because of some kind of violation of rights, some kind of unlawful action. And he was able to achieve that. He was actually voted at one point the top prosecutor in the United States back in the early 1900s. When he eventually went on to a political career, he became governor, three-time governor of California. He was a very well-liked politician. He once ran unopposed as for governor of California, which is pretty much impossible to think of today, that somebody could run as a Republican but also win the Democratic and Independent primaries. But Warren did that. He was very well liked, very well respected. Well, Dwight Eisenhower, who was running for president in 1952, didn't want Warren challenging him, so he had Warren support him in his campaign and to stay out of the race as well. And so Warren helped Eisenhower to win the presidency. And so Warren asked him what he wanted. What did you want, Earl Warren, as a reward? And he said he wanted to be on the Supreme Court. And as it happened, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court died unexpectedly, and Eisenhower picked Warren to take his place. Now, at the end of Eisenhower's time as president, after his 8 years as president, he was asked, do you have any regrets? And he supposedly said, yeah, I have two of them. And they're both sitting on the Supreme Court. Both of his appointees to the Supreme Court, Earl Warren and William Brennan, turned out to be, instead of diehard Republican conservatives or even moderates, they turned out to be pretty liberal. And so Warren had very liberal views on criminal procedure, and Eisenhower claimed to be surprised. But he shouldn't have been. If he had just looked at Warren's early career, he would have realized that Warren was very much a believer in let's professionalize the criminal justice system, let's raise its standards. And that fit in perfectly with his ideas when he became Chief Justice. So he and the other members of the Supreme Court in the 1960s especially, this was a very liberal court. They authored many of the landmark opinions in the 1960s that we're eventually going to cover in these lectures. And so the sum total of these opinions was to use the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause to expand the rights of criminal defendants. And that's why we call it the Due Process Revolution, because they expanded the meaning of the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment to require greater protection for criminal defendants, not just in the federal system, but also, and even maybe more importantly, in the states. They were looking for a more uniform standard of justice across the United States, so that when you went to Alabama, you weren't completely shocked at what was going on there. The court system was roughly the same as in New York. There were differences, and there's still differences today, but for the basic fundamental rights, there was going to be a uniform federal standard. Now, what's happened since Warren's time on the court, since the Due Process Revolution? Did it continue? The answer is no. From the late 1960s, I have here the 1970s and 1990s, but it's really when Earl Warren's time ended in 1969. So from 69 to the 1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court became more conservative. During that time period, there was only one Democratic president from 1969 through 1993. That was Jimmy Carter. And he's the only full-term president who never had a chance to appoint anyone to the Supreme Court. So we had Republicans and really conservative Republicans nominating Supreme Court justices during this time period. So the court became much more conservative. There were still some liberals. There were holdovers from the 1960s and some conservative justices who became more moderate. But nonetheless, the court did become more conservative. And what happened was the court gradually, from the 1970s, it wasn't as clear-cut conservative, but by the time we reached the 1990s, the court is much more conservative. But the court generally halted the Due Process Revolution. They put an end to it and said, we're not going to continue to expand criminal defendants' rights, but they tended to instead side more with the government. So where the Due Process Revolution court sided more with the defendant, not all the time, but more often with the defendant over the police, for instance. From the 1970s and 1990s, you saw more and more decisions where the police were winning. That yes, they have the authority to do what they do, where in the 1960s, the more liberal court might have said, no, they don't have the authority to search or to seize or whatever they did in a particular case. So generally, they halted the expansion of the Due Process Revolution. There were never enough votes to completely overturn the Due Process Revolution cases because there were still enough moderates and liberals on the court to not completely overturn cases like Miranda that we're going to cover in a couple more lectures and some of these other famous cases. But what the court did have enough votes to do was to at least change them, make exceptions to them slightly. So they didn't overrule the core decision of these Due Process Revolution cases, but they carved so many exceptions into them that you almost didn't know what the rule was. 1990s to the present, the U.S. Supreme Court, now that we've had a mix of Democrats and Republicans as president, so Bill Clinton, George Bush II, Barack Obama, and even Donald Trump with his one nominee so far, we've had kind of a mixture of Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives appointed to the court. So that means that the decisions have been more of a mixed bag too. It's not easy to predict today whether the police will win a particular case or the criminal defendant will win in a particular case. So in the late 80s, early 90s, you could be more certain that probably the police were going to win. In the 1960s, probably the criminal defendant was going to win. But now this is more of a period where everything's a little bit up in the air, and often the cases come down to the decision of one or two moderate justices who sometimes will side with the police, sometimes they'll side with the criminal defendant. So it's not as easy to predict who's going to win in these cases today. Who wins the next presidential election will probably determine whether the court swings more to the right or more to the left. But we'll just have to wait until 2020 to see the outcome of the next presidential election and to see what direction the court will actually go.